Making of the Constitution. We're also going to look at critical issues at the Constitutional Convention that they had to answer, and we'll look at the Madisonian system in this part 2 here. So they're at the Philadelphia Convention, the Constitutional Convention, and most of the founding fathers, we'll call them, were wealthy planters, merchants. There were about 55 men. They were educated. Some had political experience, and most were from the coastal regions and the larger cities, not the rural areas on the western part of the states there. They met and they figured out that their sole purpose supposedly was to amend the Articles of Confederation. But Rhode Island did not send any delegates to the Constitutional Convention, so they knew they couldn't amend it because they needed all 13 states to ratify any amendments to the Articles of Confederation. So they just overlooked that rule and they started writing. So they ignored the instructions, began writing the United States Constitution. So we're looking at some of the enlightened philosophical ideas that these founding fathers had from the Age of Enlightenment in Europe, England and France and stuff. So they looked at human nature, and they understood that people were self-interested, okay, and that government should check and contain the natural self-interest of people, which meant, people thought more of themselves than they did of other people, and they're self-interested, so they should they really need a strong government to check that self-interest. Also, political conflict was caused by the unequal distribution of wealth, which back then was pretty much property. So they understood that that was a source of political conflict, and that factions or parties arise from the unequal distribution of wealth. Okay, so they were worried about the tyranny of the majority, which were, farmers, low-level merchants that would try to seize the wealth of the wealthy, the property of the wealthy, and they also worried about the minority, the wealthy, who would try to keep the majority, unwealthy. Okay, so that caused political conflict there. Also, objects of government, property, which is land, must be protected against the tyranny of factions, and the nature of government. The secret of good government to them is a balanced government. Okay, so they weren't into having a monarchy. Again, they were thinking of something like a balanced government, and that's what they're trying to answer. Any critical issues at the convention? They had equality issues, economic issues, and individual rights issues, which we'll go over right now. Equality issues. They weren't sure how to represent the states. The Virginia plan, Virginia back then was a large state. They had their delegates came up with a plan that they would have a unicameral legislature. Okay, and the Virginia plan was representation based on a state's population. Okay, and the New Jersey plan was, equal representation throughout the states. So everyone had the same number of delegates because New Jersey was a small state. They were afraid that the big states were going to have more representation, which is what Virginia wanted. That led to the Great Compromise, or what some people call the Connecticut Compromise, because of Richard Sherman. And basically it came up with a bicameral legislature, which is a two-house legislature. The House of Representatives was based on a state's population, so Representatives from large states had more delegates, representatives, and representatives from small states had less representatives. And then there was a second house, the Senate, which had equal representation, and we know that as the U.S. Senate, and it has 2 senators per state. So that was the Connecticut or Great Compromise. Slavery was another issue of equality, and they really didn't answer the issue of slavery. They basically agreed that it existed, although that they could basically outlaw it after 1808, but it still existed, and it existed in every state except the South used slaves more. Every state except Massachusetts, but the South used slaves more for the big agriculture and farms down there. So basically, they figured out how to count slaves for representation. Should we count them as a whole person, or which the South wanted because they get more representation, but the North said no, we can't do that. So they basically came up with the 3/5 compromise. So a slave was basically 3/5 of a person. So there you go on slavery issue. Equality in voting. Delegates decided to leave voting qualifications to the states. So the states take care of elections and stuff basically there. Okay, some economic issues. Basically the states were fighting with each other. They had tariffs on products from other states to protect their merchants and people who made products in their state. Paper money was basically worthless. Congress cannot raise money because it was up to the states to give money to Congress, and they never did really. And what they needed to do was make the powers of Congress stronger and limit the powers of the states a little bit. And that caused a lot of friction, obviously. So here's some powers of the state. You can see powers of Congress, prohibitions on the states, other key provisions. Congress had new powers, and they are in Article 1 of the Constitution. Some individual rights issues. That's another issue, critical issue at the convention. They wanted to prohibit the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which means if you're jailed, you need to find out why you're jailed, basically. Ex post facto laws, another thing. You can't make a law after the fact and then, accuse that person of that law, breaking that law. They looked at religious qualifications for holding office needed to be prohibited. Okay, and strict rules of evidence for conviction of treason, not a big thing, and jury trial in criminal cases, which is a big thing. Okay. Now, I know that's kind of quick, but we're going to look at the Madisonian system, and we're going to look at the tyranny of the majority, the constitutional republic, why we are called the constitutional republic, and the end of the beginning. Okay, so James Madison, father of the Constitution, worried about the tyranny of the majority, which a lot of delegates did. So 2 things to thwart the tyranny of the majority, or a few things, was limiting majority control. Keep most of government beyond control of the masses. Okay, you didn't want the masses to control government. Also separating powers, which came from Baron de Montesquieu, an enlightened philosopher from France. He believed that a branch of government should be independent of the others, but so they couldn't control the others. No single branch could control the others. So you had checks and balances between the legislative branch, Congress, the executive branch, the President, and the judicial branch, the federal courts, the Supreme Court. The original plan was that voters would elect people in the Electoral College, and they would vote, and then some states would have voters go to the Electoral College and they would vote for the president. President would nominate judges and the Senate would confirm, which is still normal. Nowadays, the Electoral College is kind of like just a rubber stamp. It was a little bigger back then because they didn't want illiterate farmers voting for president. So the state legislatures in some states had voters vote for people to go into Electoral College to vote for the president there. Now it's a little different. It's basically Electoral College is a rubber stamp. Back then, the state legislators would elect senators from each state. That doesn't happen now because of the 17th Amendment. To the Constitution, voters in their own states vote for the senators. And also voters vote for the House of Representatives there. So let's look back at thwarting the tyranny of the majority. And I mentioned checks and balances between the branches. So each branch needs consent of the others for many actions that they can do. The president nominates a judge, but the Senate confirms. Okay, so that would be a check on presidential power. Congress makes laws, but the Supreme Court can make a law unconstitutional or say that a law is unconstitutional. That's a check on the legislative branch. Okay, so checks and balance were created. A federal system of government which divides power between national and state governments. Okay, there's a confederal system, which the Articles of Confederation were, where the states have most of the power, the national government is very limited. And then there's the federal system, which divides power. And then there's a unitary system, which the federal government, the central government, is very powerful over the states, even if there are state governments or regional governments. There's some checks and balances in the Constitution. You can look at that. Okay, don't have time to go over that right now. So the constitutional republic, what happened? The republic, basically the United States is a constitutional republic. And a republic is a form of government in which people select representatives to govern them and make law. House of Representatives, the Senate, state legislators, okay, state governors, president, stuff like that. In a direct democracy, every voter would make the law, and that would make sense in this large of a system. The thing is, it tends to favor the status quo and limit political change. So there's not huge change, even when we go from a Republican president to a Democratic president, or a Democratic Congress to a Republican Congress. The status quo pretty much stays the same. There's not any radical change between the parties. The document was approved, finally, and now it had to be ratified. And the two factions came up. The Federalists, who were for the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists that weren't for the Constitution. They thought it made central government too powerful. Okay, and I'm going to stop there, and we're going to talk about ratifying the Constitution and finish up the rest of the chapter. Okay, bye.